All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for another virtual art tour with the Addison Gallery of American Art. My name is Nicole Kramer. I am the Programming and Partnerships Manager at Memorial Hall Library in Andover. And I want to thank the Addison for allowing us to share their exhibitions and artwork with the wider community, and our partnering libraries for joining us virtually today. The Addison Gallery is located on the campus of Phillips Academy here in Andover. It is free and open to the public, and if you are close to Andover, I encourage you to visit the gallery to enjoy their regularly changing exhibitions in person, including the Florida Highwaymen Painters exhibition that we will be learning more about today. Throughout today's program, please put any questions in the Q&A, and we will plan to address as many of them as we can at the end of the talk. We are recording the program, and everyone who registered will receive a link to the recording within a few days. And today, we are joined by Gordon Wilkins, the Robert M. Walker Curator of American Art at the Addison, for a discussion of work by the Florida Highwaymen, a loosely affiliated group of 26 African-American landscape painters who sold their vivid and expressive tropical scenes door to door and out of the trunks of their cars along the coastal roads of eastern Florida from the 1950s through the 1980s. And this exhibition will be on display at the Addison through January 4th, so we hope you get a chance to see it in person after today's talk. But Gordon, thank you so much for being here. I will now turn things over to you.
Thank you so much, Nicole. It's such a pleasure to be joining you today. And I'm just blown away that there are nearly 120 people here at 3 p.m. on a Wednesday. So we're really, we really applaud your dedication, and thank you so much for sticking with us and for attending. So I'm just going to share my screen and then we'll get started. Okay, and then we will go full screen. Okay. So the show that I'm going to be talking about today is called Making Their Way, the Florida Highwaymen Painters. And it's a show that's derived largely from one collection. So that's why the vast majority of the slides, you will not see a credit line for the owner, because there is one owner, and that is Jonathan Otto, who is an alumnus of Phillips Academy and a great supporter of the Addison. He has a remarkable collection, which I'll speak to momentarily, of Highwaymen paintings, including many more that did not make the wall here at Andover. We have about 90 or so Highwaymen paintings on view currently. There are probably 3 times that in John's overall collection. And he's been collecting since the 1990s, which is when the Highwaymen sort of became this branded institution that has attracted slew of collectors and great interest. He was sort of at the vanguard of that wave of collectors in the 90s. And so the material that he has collected is really incredible and extraordinarily choice. So it was a dream to work with. We also have loans in the show from the collection of Scott Schlesinger, who's another major Highwaymen collector in Florida. So the show will be open into January, and it's actually traveling to the Westmoreland Museum of American Art outside of Pittsburgh this winter into spring. So if you are in the Pittsburgh area, feel free to check it out there. The show, and I'll mention, I know that this event has been promoted on a lot of the Highwaymen community, so there are probably people in this chat who know infinitely more about the Highwaymen than I do. So I think instead of trying to give an authoritative history of the Highwaymen, I'm going to walk through my own thought, how I approach this project, of course, weave in the story of the Highwaymen painters, and discuss a little bit at the end a complementary exhibition called Captive Lands, which is installed. This exhibition, we're looking at the title wall, that occupies one half of our second floor gallery. So 5 full galleries on the second floor are dedicated solely to the Florida Highwaymen painters. And then we have 4 galleries also on that second floor that are comprised largely of permanent collection works that have been organized into a show called Captive Lands, which I hope to be able to just sort of briefly touch on. So the Florida Highwaymen, as Nicole mentioned, refers to, and I should at the outset, the term highwaymen, Florida Highwaymen, is a misnomer, because I think when you hear something like a collective, these collective nouns meant to represent large groups of people, you might assume that there was such a thing as a unified sort of highwaymen group or a school of highwaymen. It refers to a very loosely affiliated, in fact, certain highwaymen didn't know other highwaymen. Some were very close friends. A group of 26 official, and I'll get to that distinction and why it is so delicate and quite frankly fraught. 26 official highwaymen. There are works from all 26 of the official highwaymen, which is no small feat that any collector could own examples by all 26. All 26 are represented in the exhibition. But when you come and see the show, you will notice that certain artists are represented in greater depth, and I'll speak to that as well. But there is something truly from everyone. And it refers to this incredible efflorescence of painters, African American painters in the area of Florida that is around Fort Pierce and Gifford, so around the Vero Beach area, who began painting beginning in the 50s, going into the 70s, although there are still living highwaymen. There are artists who paint in the highwayman style. There are second generation legacy highwaymen. But the core group kind of sprung out of this very particular area in Florida in the 50s into the 60s, and then sort of waning into the 70s, who started painting these vivid to the point of lurid in many cases, landscape paintings that depict this untouched sort of virgin tropical paradise. And I think for people today who are, and speaking as someone who's lived almost their entire life in the Northeast, we have very particular understandings or conceptions of Florida. And I don't know if we think of it necessarily now as this untouched virgin natural paradise. But what they were capturing was true at the time. They were capturing scenes that unfortunately in many cases no longer exist of relative swaths of untouched landscape. Of course, there's incredible natural beauty that remains in Florida, and we'll speak to some of the conditions that have led to the sort of erosion of untouched wildlands in Florida. But the highwaymen were capturing this picture postcard, perfect view of a moment in time in Florida and selling their wares. Because they were African American, they did not have access to traditional systems of representation for artists. So they were forced to both paint and distribute, to act as their own agents in many cases, distribute their own work, and that came through the selling of work door to door, out of the trunks of their car, pulled over at the side of the interstate, which is really where the term highwayman is derived. And there are these remarkable works, but I think I'll speak for myself. When I first encountered it, and here we have a few photographs of highwaymen artists: Al Black, Harold Newton, Marianne Carroll, who was the only highway woman, Al Black, again, Robert Lewis, and James Gibson. But when I first encountered their work, to be honest, and there's a very wide spectrum of quality, and that's something that I think we need to fully acknowledge, that within the amorphous group that we call the highwaymen, which of course again, was not something that was known to the highwaymen when they were working. They did not call themselves the highwaymen. But when you first encounter their work or some of their work, some of the things that immediately came to mind were artists like Bob Ross, artists like Thomas Kincaid, who painted these treacly, almost too perfect landscape paintings of the American landscape, or these sort of fantasy landscapes in the case of Thomas Kincaid. These are, in our sort of elitist art world, these are the antithesis of, great modern painting. This is what we would consider kitsch. I think a lot of those designations, those differences have eroded. And I think, luckily, we're now in a moment where I doubt this show would have been presented at the Addison 30 years ago. But today, the boundaries between sort of high and low modernism, the boundaries between the sort of insider artists and outsider artists have been exposed as very porous. They're very porous, malleable boundaries. And I think there's a greater understanding of this full spectrum of visual culture and an appreciation for artists who fall outside of the conventional tropes, the conventional systems of education, of art schools, people who are existing outside of the metropolitan areas of the United States, outside of New York, which has for so long been really the center of American art. So much so that really anything produced outside of New York was seen as provincial. That has, again, these attitudes are rapidly shifting. And also, I started to really, initially you think of this very particular moment of time. These paintings, when you see them, you think of the 60s, you think of the 70s, you think of things like paintings on velvet, which is actually Harold Newton, probably the finest highwayman painter in terms of skill, started his career as an artist painting religious scenes on velvet. So there is a precedent for that association. You think of this sort of 60s kitsch, you think of motel room art, you think of paint by numbers, you think of these things that to many would have been considered sort of in bad taste, but I think we have a much more nuanced understanding of visual culture and an embrace of material culture broadly. And these arbitrary divisions between what is and what isn't art, what isn't commercial, are starting to erode. So I think initially, I had to fight my own biases, engaging with Highwayman material from the onset. This is before I really was able to dive into it. But I think, again, I have been in my career and in my studies, I've always been someone who's interested in the points in which these sort of high and low cultures overlap. I've done a lot on tourist art in the past, and Marsden Hartley, who was considered to be about the most high modernist artist as you could get, but towards the end of his life was making scenes with a tourist market in mind. So I've always been comfortable to occupy these kind of murky spaces between what is considered high culture and what is considered low, which I think allowed me to sort of jump on and embrace this material quite quickly, and perhaps in ways that others might not be comfortable embracing it. The other thing that immediately I started to think about was the profusion of Florida kitsch. We have in the complimentary exhibition Captive Lands. To be quite honest, I went crazy on eBay for about 3 months before the show opened and bought incredible tourist memorabilia from Florida, which I've filled an entire case full of postcards, brochures, souvenir photographs, alligator salt and pepper shakers. But this is, of course, not purely a mid-20th century phenomenon. The history of tourism in Florida goes back into the mid-19th century, and actually before, in terms of European exploration of Florida. But you start in the 1860s, and then with the advent of a rail system that connected Florida with the rest of the East Coast, you begin to see this development of a major tourist industry. And places like Silver Springs, which was one of the very first tourist destinations in Florida, you begin to see them sort of entering this very familiar cycle, which is a cycle that's explored in the Captive Lands exhibition. And I've paired that, the sort of Florida memorabilia with Niagara Falls, because both Florida and Niagara Falls in the 19th century were revered as almost spiritual sites of pilgrimage. And you sort of see this cycle emerge as accessibility increases, as it becomes less and less expensive to visit. You have, of course, larger groups of tourists coming. You have to support a major tourist infrastructure that requires, all kinds of buildings, all kinds of development, which of course disrupts the natural beauty that the tourists are there to see. So it's this this catch-22 of tourism, where particularly tied to natural beauty, where you have with Niagara Falls, when it was totally inaccessible, you had to be extraordinarily affluent to, voyage into the wilderness of what was then still the wilderness of the East Coast. And people would genuflect in front of the falls. They would be, humbled. They would fall to their knees and proclaim that they had, communed with the spirit of God. I think that would be a hard experience to have today when you're dealing with, Ripley's Believe It or Not, with a roller coaster on the top of it and a million waxworks museums. And that, again, it's not a recent phenomenon. That was happening in the 19th century as well. In fact, Oscar Wilde visited Niagara Falls in the 1880s and said, he was disappointed. How could he not be disappointed? And that, in fact, the honeymoon at Niagara Falls was the first in a string of great disappointments for the American wife. That you build up this image of something, and then, of course, you're confronted with the reality of it. So again, kind of not separating, but kind of finding ways to consider the Highwaymen work in dialogue with this larger profusion of Florida, and really thinking about how central to the image of Florida the Highwaymen paintings are, and how really what we think perhaps of out of Florida in this kind of high key color palette, this exuberant, these bright oranges, bright yellows, bright reds, palm trees, poinciana trees. A lot of that iconography is reinforced and developed in the Florida Highwaymen paintings. I mentioned motel art. I thought this was kind of funny because this is not a Highwayman painting on the left, but on the right, there is a Highwayman painting in the background. That is a still from the, I don't want to say, it's a pretty bad movie, but worth watching. Wild Things from 1998 with Matt Dillon. And you can see, and Denise Richards, you can see in the background a Highwayman painting, which is quite visible in a very erotically charged motel scene. So again, these are the assumptions that people were dealing with. And this is really the state of the Highwaymen paintings up until the 90s, where they were so ubiquitous. They were everywhere in Florida, particularly around the Fort Pierce area. You couldn't really go into a bank that didn't have Highwayman paintings hanging on the walls. You couldn't go into someone's home without seeing a Highwayman painting. But by the 80s, 90s, their work had really fallen out of fashion. And a lot of that has to do with the recalibration of the Florida tourist market away from interstate highways and really centralized at Disney World, which before I started this project, I'll come clean and say my entire experience with the state of Florida was through the prism of Disney World. It's a lot, and this show has opened my eyes to just how fascinating and rich and understudied and underappreciated, particularly in the Northeast, the incredible visual culture of Florida is. In the 90s, though, there was the beginning of a reconsideration, reevaluation of this material. And that was largely through two men in Florida. The first really identified Highwaymen artist by traveling around Florida, going to junk shops and seeing he was working on a project on Florida art and discovering all of these paintings that were sort of uniformly scaled on almost all of them are on Upson board, which is a compressed fiber board, framed with simple crown molding, and he kept seeing them everywhere. The Highwayman name was really coined at that point, and then it was not until Gary Monroe, who's an author and photographer in his own right, wrote the first major publication on the Highwaymen in the early 2000s, that the Highwaymen sort of rose, or the appreciation of the Highwaymen sort of became more apparent, that people began to really take notice. And with that, particularly with this publication, so too was created a major market for the Highwayman painting. So Highwayman painters, when they were selling their works in the 50s, 60s, 70s, were selling them for, $25, $35. Now certain works by Highwaymen can reach 5-6 figures. So there's been a major boom in the market for Highwaymen, and it was largely due to Gary Monroe's book setting that sort of setting it up for this major reconsideration. So very consequentially, in Gary's book, he created a list of 26 Highwaymen based on his own research and his own criteria for inclusion. That list of 26 is incomplete. It's a list that perhaps includes people who maybe wouldn't themselves even consider themselves Highwaymen. It's full of, there are people who really did not want to be called Highwaymen. Of course, if you think of the origin of the term Highwaymen, it refers to, criminal activity taking part, thinking of stagecoach robbers and mysterious deaths on the highway. For many of these artists, becoming an artist, painting was a way to avoid a life that could lead to criminality. And so after, taking this virtuous path and making an honest living by producing works of art and selling them, to then years later be called or given the name of essentially a criminal, was something that was very difficult for a number of the Highwaymen artists to sort of come around to accept. But this list of 26 kind of was further kind of made concrete when also in the early 2000s, the list of 26 artists, the 26 artists were entered into the Florida Artists Hall of Fame. And so that sort of kind of froze this list in amber, and it has not been modified since. And I'll speak to that in a little bit about the sort of how problematic that is. I'll say also that this is, first of all, it's not a movement, but it's the easiest way to discuss it is to refer to the Highwaymen painters as the Highwaymen. To it's, as I mentioned, a misnomer to consider this an organized school of painting. But it's created this dynamic where there are official highwaymen and then there are unofficial highwaymen. There are legacy highwaymen, and if and I hate myself for making this association, but if you think about, you can make sparkling wine anywhere, but you cannot call your sparkling wine champagne unless it's made in the Champagne region of France. That sort of mentality sticks with the highwaymen, where you can paint in the style of the highwaymen, and in some cases you may have you probably should have been put on the list of highwaymen, but because you are not in the Florida Artists Hall of Fame, you cannot officially brand yourself as an official highwayman painter. And there is really no incentive for the highwaymen, of which there are only a few, unfortunately, living today, to increase their ranks. Of course, there's, with scarcity of material comes, greater prices that you can command. So to kind of dilute the market is not advantageous. So that is quite fraught. The other thing that I find, and to just sort of come clean with at the onset, that I find really problematic and difficult about the highwaymen is that it's, again, a movement, for lack of a better word, that has really been defined by white individuals who were not there. Really, the entire narrative has been the popular narrative of the highwaymen is one that has been shaped not by the highwaymen artists themselves, but by people from outside and white people at that. There are very complicated racial dynamics at play. The highwaymen were producing works of art for almost an entirely white audience. If you think that's not surprising if you think of the economic hardship that African Americans faced in Florida at the height of Jim Crow when the highwaymen sort of emerged. You can't eat art, I think Bell Hooks said. So you can't eat art off the dinner table. There were other concerns. Art is, as much as we like to think of it as something beyond a commercial commodity or a luxury, it is a luxury. And if you had to make the choice between feeding your family and buying a landscape painting, you would be feeding your family. And so there was not at the time a major collector class in Florida of African American patrons. So it's a movement that has of paintings that were largely consumed by a white audience and then continue to be consumed by a white audience. And I'll speak to that later. I want to bring it up to the exhibition, and this is a really wonderful publication. Catherine Enns, who I believe is on this Zoom, wrote this publication, which is derived largely from Jonathan Otto's collection. So most of the work, if not almost all of it, in the show here at the Addison is reproduced in this really wonderful book that was first published in the late aughts, and has went out of print, became very collectible. It's been reprinted and is available for sale. And it's, I think, one of the most definitive histories, and certainly one of the most readable and engaging histories of the highwaymen artists. And I really recommend that publication. And it provided an invaluable foundation for my project. And I should mention, I do not see this project as the be and end all highwaymen project. I pray it is not. I really hope it is not. What's most exciting about this project, we did not do our own catalog, for example. What's most exciting for this project, I think, is our geography, and that this is material that is very well known in the state of Florida. Known in specialist circles. There are works at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in DC. It's known by a specialized audience, those who are well versed in African American art primarily. But outside of the state of Florida, it's relatively unknown. So this is, I think, going to be, and has been already, just anecdotally, a major revelation to people in the Northeast, because this is the first major presentation, and certainly the first presentation at this scale of highwaymen work, perhaps outside of Florida, but certainly in New England, if not the entire Northeast. So we are very fortunate to present this material and offer it up to our audiences, and then encourage people to learn more. And hopefully this show, in some way, directly or indirectly, will inspire further examination of the highwaymen. And I think also what I wanted to do with this show was to contextualize the Highwaymen, to put them in a larger art historical narrative, because they have been sort of considered in a vacuum, and largely considered in really in relation to only one artist, and that is Beanie Backus, who I'll speak of, a white landscape painter in Florida. What has not really happened is the sort of art historical scholarship of placing the Highwaymen in a much broader tradition of landscape painting, not just in Florida, but in the United States. And I'm hopeful that future exhibitions will include, and museums will continue to, massage the narratives of what American art is and can be, to include those artists who fall outside of the conventional modes of art museum exhibition and galleries. So, sort of back to the beginning. John Otto lived in Florida for many years. He started his collecting journey. He actually wanted to buy a David Hockney pool. He had a very particular place in mind in his condo. He met with a gallerist in Florida, and then, flash forward 30 years, he has over 300 Highwaymen paintings in his collection. So this Hockney, he was dissuaded and turned on to the Highwaymen, because the story is remarkable. To think of this group of African American artists at the height of Jim Crow working as professional, in terms of being compensated, earning in some cases very good livings by painting these vibrant scenes of the natural world that surrounded them. It's an incredible story that captures the imagination of really anyone who comes across it. So it's not surprising that John was swept up in the excitement, but it is surprising that he built, one of the definitive collections of Highwaymen artists. And this is he lived in Florida. He's since relocated to New York, and most of his collection is in storage. So my colleagues and I had a number of visits to a Westies location on Long Island, and would pull out painting after painting and line these hallways. And you would just, you could see Highwayman paintings what seemed like for miles and miles. So it was a bit overwhelming. Where do you even start? Was something that I had to take a lot of time. And one of the most important choices that I made, knowing and recognizing my own blind spots when it comes to the state of Florida, was to go to the place and to go to Fort Pierce. And I should mention that Fort Pierce has really cornered the market on the Highwaymen story, but is not the only location associated with the Highwaymen. Gifford, Florida is also almost of equal importance. Many of the artists who became Highwaymen were from there, people like Harold Newton. And Gifford remains one of the most impoverished communities in Florida. It is the sort of African-American town that's associated with Vero Beach. It was the very segregated community that has been not particularly well served by the state of Florida over its history. And because they don't have the infrastructure that Fort Pierce has, they have not really been able to take advantage of the great interest in the Highwaymen. So in Fort Pierce, you can see a Highwayman Heritage Trail. There are obelisks, there are maps. It is a very, very important part of the culture there. So I went there. I had a really remarkable time, a really eye-opening time. There's a really wonderful woman, Susan Harris, who works for Jetsons, which is an appliance company. And you might think, what does an appliance company have to do with the Florida Highwaymen? Jetsons has a really remarkable collection of Florida Highwaymen paintings. I was taken behind the scenes and visited their offices and saw, walls that were just, covered in Highwayman painting after Highwayman painting. And it was really interesting for me, and someone who's working kind of in this rarefied art, quote unquote, art world, where, you're not necessarily encountering artworks in appliance store offices every day. So for me, it was quite novel and really interesting to think about how these paintings, the lived history of these paintings, how these paintings continue to be enjoyed, experienced in places that are outside of the traditional art world, places like appliance stores. I also visited a number of shops. This is a great image of a really noteworthy Highwayman collector by the name of Roger Lytle. I did not take this photograph. I was able to find it online, and hopefully he doesn't object, because it's all over the internet for me, including it. But when you visit his home, he has an entire storage closet filled to the brim with Highwayman paintings. So there is this. I don't think it's wrong. This obsessive the best collectors are obsessives. This obsessive collecting group of collectors, a small group of collectors in Florida who are extraordinarily dedicated to the highwaymen and highwaymen artists and the collecting and sale of highwaymen work. There are dedicated highwaymen art auctions in Florida. There are multiple websites. There are essentially business analysts who analyze the highwaymen market. It is a really hot commodity in Florida. That, of course, brings its own ethical issues. Unfortunately, the highwaymen painters themselves, they did not have the luxury of holding on to early work. They were painting works not for the sake of art, but for the sake of survival. They had to sell work to make a living. And so we think of the sort of tortured artist who never sells their wares and is sitting on, hundreds of examples of their work by the time they die. That is not the case with highwaymen, because they would sell wet, while the panels were still wet, they would be sold, and they were not holding on to them. They were not spending time with these works. So when it came time in the 90s for the highwaymen to sort of receive this new attention, unfortunately, the original artists were, for the most part, kept out of the market boom because they no longer held on to the most desirable work, which for highwayman collectors, the vintage of John's collection, the 50s, 60s, and early 70s, is most desirable. Many returned to painting. Some continued to paint all through their lives, but a number came back in the 90s, and they discovered that their new works just couldn't command the prices that their vintage works, which they had no access to, commanded. This is unfortunately not an isolated incident. I think you see a lot of this really uncomfortable dynamic at play in a lot of outsider and vernacular artists, where vernacular artists, they are not keyed into the success of their work necessarily. They don't derive a great deal of financial benefit, and so these collectors who are trading these works have created this whole economic system from which the highwaymen artists themselves are in many ways excluded. And speaking of exclusion, I was also able to meet this really wonderful gentleman, Jimmy Stovall, who positions himself as the 27th highwayman. He is someone who I think very few people would disagree with the statement that he should have been considered a highwayman. There were various sort of unspoken criteria for inclusion in the list of 26. And because Jimmy Stovall didn't rely solely on painting for income, he worked for the telephone company, that sort of excluded him from being part of the official 26 highwaymen. So he is now retired and painting, but his market cannot reach the market of those official highwaymen. So again, the choices of really a small group of white men in Florida in the 90s have these ramifications that are still very present. People who are included, people who are excluded, people who shouldn't have been on the list but are, people who should have but aren't. And Jimmy is one of those who really should have been but is not part of the official highwaymen list of highwaymen painters, but still to this day continues to paint. He opened his white van in the middle of a parking lot, and that's never a good sign to have a white van open in the middle of a parking lot. But you open the back of his van, and he just had this crate with painting after painting after painting. Pulled them out. People from the restaurant would come out. I mean, it's this very kind of almost common sight in Florida. They were really excited to see it, and he was making sales out of the back of his van. So there is still a very robust market for highwaymen legacy and highwaymen paintings to this day. Actually, that's a long diversion. We've taken a long detour, if you'll pardon the highway pun, to get back to the exhibition. So here we are in the gallery where we started, and this initial gallery, which is the largest in terms of square footage, looks at three of the sort of most pivotal characters in the beginning, the origin story of what would become known as the Highwaymen painters. Those are Albert Ernest Beanie Backus, who was a white landscape painter from a Fort Pierce, Florida native, who had a remarkable career as one of the most sought after landscape painters in Florida in the 20th century. Harold Newton, really the eldest of the Highwaymen, was originally from Georgia, but came to Florida. I mentioned he started painting religious scenes on velvet. He fell in with Beanie Backus, who for the time was a remarkably progressive figure. He opened his home and studio up to really anyone who wanted to come, regardless of race. And so he really warmly embraced African Americans at the height of Jim Crow in a very segregated community in Florida, in the Deep South. That's another thing. I think the Disneyfication of Florida has really obscured the racial histories and struggle in Florida, which were no less pronounced than in other places of the Deep South. We somehow think of Florida as something other than the South in many ways, but I think the racial dynamics at play cannot be overstated. This is Jim Crow South. This is racially segregated South. Harold Newton is pictured here. Alfred Hare is probably the most important in terms of the kind of essence of the Highwaymen, what the Highwaymen became known for, which was rapidly executed paintings. And he really pioneered this system of distribution, most likely. Both were acquainted with Bacchus. Newton on sort of a more casual level. Alfred Hare actually received lessons. He was his art teacher at a local school, Zenobia Jefferson, actually brought him to Bacchus's studio because she recognized his talent as a young man. And it was said that, Bacchus said, "I'll give you lessons for a quarter." And Alfred Hare's sister apparently decided to, in lieu of payment, to clean Bacchus's studio. So Bacchus really helped to inspire these two, pillars of the Highwayman movement. And he also very much, and here's some of his work. So he was a very competent painter. He worked in what we would kind of consider to be an impressionistic style. He did a lot of work with palette knives, which would be kind of one of the key themes of a lot of the production of Highwayman paintings. But they, I think a lot of people don't look at the broader picture when it comes to the Highwaymen. They sort of only kind of define the Highwaymen in relation to one figure, and that's Bacchus. That Bacchus sort of imparted all of the knowledge on the Highwaymen, and that he himself existed in a vacuum and was not, as he was, part of a much longer tradition of landscape painting in Florida. He is treated as this sort of sui generis genius, and he's often positioned as a kind of white savior, which is something that which is a narrative that I did not want to reinforce in this exhibition. There have also, over the years, been accusations that the Highwaymen stole photographs of Bacchus's paintings. I think there's a lot. That's a really loaded accusation to make against Highwaymen artists. What I would say is that all artists are great artists steal, and there's the Picasso quote that I'm butchering, but the history of art is full of appropriation. And Bacchus was looking back in history. He was looking at artists like who came before him, like Thomas Moran, artists like George Inness. There is an entire history of landscape painting in Florida that the Highwaymen have largely been excluded from, but that they are very much part of. And he's looking back at people like Winslow Homer, who spent a lot of time in Florida, made really exquisite watercolors over several visits. He was a really avid fly fisherman and angler broadly, and really enjoyed visiting Florida. So there's incredible body of Winslow Homer work dealing with Florida. But I think the sort of most, the clearest association, or the kind of line that you can really draw from an artist of this time to Bacchus to the Highwaymen is Martin Johnson Head, who did these. In the Highwayman community, they're called they're referred to as fire skies. These vibrant, almost lurid paintings of the Florida landscape, because those colors exist. I mean, this is really, it's a remarkable place where you get remarkable light effects. And he was just really smitten with Florida and painted dozens of canvases of Florida. This is a monumental painting that's at the Minnesota Marine Art Museum, of all places, but was purchased at auction for quite a princely sum. But I think if you think of the Harold Newton painting that I showed the very first slide, you can see there's definitely a Martin Johnson Head influence. It's not just Bacchus. I mean, he is on the shoulders of an entire multiple generations of artists preceding them. And that's something that I really wanted to bring to the fore in this show. So this is these three paintings. They're the paintings on the left, Thomas Moran, then Herman Herzog, then Herman Herzog, and then that's a Kensett on the right. That's from our collection. So just pretend that doesn't exist. These are in the complementary show, and I really wanted to, because again, the Highwaymen are sort of often the work is secondary to the narrative. The narrative is really what carries the day. I think people buy Highwaymen paintings because of the narrative in many cases. They are not necessarily buying them. That's not, of course, the only reason, but the narrative is really sold alongside the image itself. But to step back, kind of divorce, which it's impossible to do, but try in your mind to divorce the Highwaymen from the story, and then think about what is informing this? Where are they coming from? And I wanted to include 19th century examples to establish this legacy, this art historical history, this family tree that stretches back 100 years prior to the advent of the Highwaymen. So these works, the three really remarkable paintings, were lent to us by Scott Schlesinger very generously, and we're very thankful for that. But you can see here, I've really set up this conversation. So I really see these shows as one in the same in a way. I think I would ideally like people to see the Highwaymen show first, and then think about what they saw in relation to what I presented in capturing in Captive Lands. And even in this moment where the two shows intersect, the pink is of course the Highwaymen, and then the sort of greenish gray is Captive Lands. And then you see this great Moran of a hammock or a group of palm trees, and then you see this great Newton on the left. And again, visually, just to visitors, trying to get them to think outside of the narrow kind of time frame of the Highwaymen as active artists, and think about the larger span of art history and where these artists fit. So I think that Bacchus definitely provided incredible inspiration, direct instruction, and also they looked to him. They saw his great success. They saw what worked, what didn't work. They were very savvy businessmen in many cases. And they absorb what they needed to, but all artists do that. All artists have to learn from someone. And I think the Highwaymen, accusing them of theft in a way, I think that is an accusation that's tied to deeper, more sinister sentiments. That we should really think about the Highwaymen in conversation with all of these artists that I've mentioned. There's also a really amazing history of Black landscape painting that has not been fully explored. Henry Ossawa Tanner, the great Pittsburgh-born African-American artist, student of Thomas Eakins, worked in Florida. And these are two paintings from a period of time that he visited Florida in the 1890s. And then I've been thinking a lot recently about this larger, thinking about this trajectory. And there are artists before. There's Robert Duncanson, for example, who was working earlier than Henry Ossawa Tanner. But if there is a kind of an interesting maybe idea for a project. I don't know if I'll do it. Someone hopefully will do it. We focus so much on Black figuration, but to think about the Black landscape tradition and drawing some sort of arrow from Henry Ossawa Tanner to people like Harold Newton, to Richard Mayhew, who used a similarly lurid, intense, vibrant color palette, to artists like Cy Gavin, a much younger artist in his early 40s, who is painting these exuberant landscape paintings. I don't think Cy Gavin is perhaps even aware of the Highwaymen, or certainly has not had have not had the opportunity to perhaps engage with the Highwaymen. But I think hopefully this show will help to introduce this work to artists, and that's what I'm sort of most excited about. We have an artist visiting today who's a really fantastic landscape painter who had heard about the Highwaymen for years but had never had the opportunity to see their work in person. So I think this show, instead of making some sort of definitive curatorial statement on the Highwaymen, I hope will open up possibilities for future engagement. Again, looping around another detour back to the show. So we have these three artists discussed in conversation. And I did want to set up, though, these moments of sort of inspiration and then continuation. So this inspiration and transformation, I meant to say transformation instead of continuation. So on one of the first walls, I have these three works positioned really side by side. So we have Beanie Bacchus, the sort of the originator in a way, the sort of blueprint for, or perceived to be the blueprint, although if we forget what I just said the last 20 minutes, he's part of a much longer tradition, but the most immediate source of inspiration. Beanie Backus to Harold Newton, Alfred Hare, looking at things like palette knife treatment. Beanie Backus used palette knife to evoke these really, incredibly lush scenes with a relative economy of means. That was something that was picked up on by artists like Harold Newton and Alfred Hare. Alfred Hare took it even beyond that and pioneered this style of really rapidly executed work that was called fast grass. And so looking at, yes, there are these points of continuity where artists are, there are even direct sort of copies of Bacchus compositions. But I think if they were just mere copies, it would be one thing. But what I find with the Highwaymen work is that it's so exhilarating, that their choices are so unexpected. The color choices, the application of paint, it's so gestural, it's so alive, it's almost abstract expressionist in certain cases in its paint handling. That yes, they were started, that Beanie Backus helped to light the spark, but the Highwaymen really cultivated the flame. That they took this kind of stagnant landscape tradition and just turned it up to 11. They infused it with such energy and dynamism. They were known, they were not laboring in obscurity. The Highwaymen artists, particularly Newton and Hare, were known. There are great newspaper articles that document them in their time in the 50s and 60s. This article on the left discusses how Harold Newton was able to trade a painting to pay for the hospital fees associated with the birth of his twins. And then you have another article on Alfred Hare, who is sort of the spiritual leader of what would become the Highwaymen. But these were artists who were familiar to the people around Florida. They were not obscure, languishing, laboring in complete obscurity. They had something that people wanted, and because they had paintings and because they had something that a white audience craved, they were able to sort of not transcend, but they were able to navigate the realities of Jim Crow South in a way that other African Americans were not. They, largely opportunities for African Americans in Florida in the 50s, 60s were quite limited to primarily physical labor, agricultural jobs, working in the orange groves. And this was really one of the only ways for these African American men and one woman, Marianne Carroll. This was the opportunity to kind of go on a different path. This was something they saw that, the people that came after Newton and Hare saw the success, particularly of Hare, that he would send 30 paintings out, he would sell 30 paintings. They saw him driving nice cars. He was able to sort of throw off a lot of the restrictions, the oppression of the Jim Crow South of that period, and attain a better lifestyle, and one that was really quite compelling to many people who would then learn to paint because they idolized Hare and wanted to kind of get a piece of that. So you see the exchange between the elder Bacchus and his younger sort of mentees. This is a mixture. I didn't want all Bacchus on one wall, all Newton on one wall, all Hare on all. So they're interspersed. It's meant to be a conversation, and to look at how, again, that there are points of continuity, but then thinking more critically about what the Highwaymen did in their panels, how they pushed these kind of tried and true motifs into a different arena through the use of color, through gestural application of paint, etc. So hopefully opening up our perception. Here are some kind of overviews, I should say, of this first gallery. I'll mention that the title wall is a color that's called Florida Pink, and then the rest of the walls are done in this light pink that's called Pink Cadillac. The Cadillac was, which I love that because to own a Cadillac was sort of the ultimate status symbol, and many of the Highwaymen artists explicitly stated that that was their dream, to own a Cadillac, to make a living, to make such a living that they could afford a Cadillac. So I kind of left, even though that was totally unintentional, I did not pick the color because of that. I like that association. So now we're going to move into another gallery, and some themes have emerged. Catherine Enn's book of the auto collection was really pivotal in kind of analyzing the language of the Highwaymen, the iconography of the Highwaymen, the motifs. They're referred to as templates in the book. I would prefer motifs because I think template implies some sort of rote copying. I would say that they took motifs and then expanded upon them, and they all went in different directions. Again, they're often considered as a monolith, the Highwaymen, but there is a wide range of skill, ability within the ranks and within the show. I think you can, for example, see the same motif represented, but see it in radically different ways. So I also got interested in the idea of seriality, which is a modernist concept that we apply to sort of the fine arts, quote unquote. But these artists, just like artists in New York at the same time, were experimenting with repetition, which is again not even new to the art world in the 50s and 60s, but to look at, to provide the exercise of, what is to kind of create, to take a standard motif and then expand it in many different ways is quite interesting. So the first gallery off of the main gallery with Bacchus, Newton, and Hare deals with a single motif, and that is the poinciana tree. And these are these beautifully flame red trees that originated likely in Madagascar, and are distributed all around the world, but have become really synonymous with Florida. And they have these really just riotous blooms. And this was really the preferred, most popular by far motif of the Highwaymen. Every Highwayman artist did poincianas. They were marketable, they were popular. This was, you can imagine if you just had a wonderful vacation to Florida, you want something to remember it by, you get this brilliant red, tree that leaps off of the panel. In some cases, there's really interesting optical effects that are associated with this contrast of this intense red against often blue grounds. So I have an entire wall. Sorry, I should also say, so I was also thinking about, how we think about themes like seriality and, in the context of artists who are working at the same time as the Highwaymen, like Andy Warhol, who was working on a commercial scale and employing a lot of the sort of techniques that the Highwaymen were employing. He was outsourcing some of the labor. The Highwaymen artists, particularly Alfred Hare, it was sort of a family affair. The business, he would hammer boards onto trees and invite people from his family and the community to fill in bits of the canvas to make of the panel to make frames, etc. Andy Warhol, of course, ran his factory, but you for some reason were able to sort of accept the commercial side of Andy Warhol, whereas I think the commercial aims of the Highwaymen has in many ways invalidated their contributions in the eyes of many, and that their enterprise has been construed as purely commercial, and because of that, not art. I would say that all art, unfortunately, is tied, for better or for worse, is tied to commerce going back hundreds and hundreds of years, and you cannot divorce one from the other. Artists have always responded to a market. You look at the patronage system. Artists do not, if you want to survive and live as an artist, you don't have the luxury, very rarely do you have the luxury of painting only what you want to paint. You are responding to a market, and the Highwaymen, just like Warhol, were doing that. Here's the Poinciana room. So we have this wall of just pure depictions of Poinciana from many different Highwaymen artists. And then flanking this main, I'll go back. It's a beautiful gallery wall. So I know we're probably going to run late on time, but just take that in for a moment. I think it looks quite nice, but I'll move to the next. And you'll see, you can kind of barely make out, but you'll see there are labels next to all of these paintings with portraits. And so all 26 official Highwaymen are represented with a bio and photograph in the exhibition, which I think was part of my overall arching strategy to sort of individualize this seemingly monolithic group, and to help people develop their own kind of connoisseurial eye for the differences between artists. So their individuality as artists is foregrounded in this exhibition. What's really exciting is that there's a very high concentration of depictions of Black life in John's collection, which is relatively rare in the Highwaymen oeuvre. And there are said to be over 200,000 that there were over 200,000 paintings produced by the Highwaymen. Of course, many of those have since disappeared or been destroyed, but there are still tens and tens and tens and tens of thousands of paintings out there. Very few of them, though, comparatively, have human figures. So these are images of Black life. It's certainly a romantic vision of Black life, of this sort of rural, dignified rural poverty that would have appealed to a white audience. I think there was a lot of a lot of thought at one point also that Beanie Bacchus never depicted African Americans. We do have a painting with an African American figure in our exhibition, so it is not unprecedented. But largely, the work of the Highwaymen is largely comprised of pure landscape. So it's very exciting to be able to bring these works together. And then we see here 3 works by 3 different artists, all very different, but then you start to think about the ways in which they are quite similar. There's a very similar color palette that links them all, and then you start to see this clothesline appears in all of these paintings, and it's almost the same combination of colors. So there is this really interesting sort of synergy across artists that they were working within these sort of motifs that were kind of standardized, but bringing their own spin to it in quite radically different ways. The Poinciana tree is also on the sort of commemorative Highwaymen license plate in Florida. So the Poinciana is the symbol, really, of the Highwaymen, even more so than palm trees. I think when we think of Florida, we think of palm trees, but the Poinciana is the signature motif. So here we are looking out from the Poinciana room into the next gallery, which looks at the backcountry, which is a part of the landscape of Florida that I think most people outside of Florida, or those who don't have a great familiarity with Florida, know very little about. As I said, in coming from New England, you know Miami, you might know the Panhandle, Disney World, but you don't really think about the vast expanse in between the Gulf Coast and the Atlantic coast of Florida. Florida was one of the leading cattle producers of cattle in the United States for a time, and so there are massive tracts of land that have been devoted to ranching. And so this section of the exhibition really looks at those non kind of coastal scenes, the inland scenes, the backcountry scenes, and across a variety of artists. Hezekiah Baker, who I see this palette and I think of Thomas Hart Benton. He was really specialized on these kind of backcountry pictures. That's the other thing that's really interesting, is that, the Highwaymen were not all painting the same groups of motifs. Many specialized in particular themes. So some really specialized in particular on wildlife. Wildlife animals are kind of, other than birds, are sort of rare to find. So paintings like the one on the right, it would be very collectible, very desirable to Highwaymen collectors. The Brahmin bull was a heat-resistant breed that was brought to Florida and was really the centerpiece of the cattle production, the cattle market and industry in Florida. Another glimpse at this backcountry section of the exhibition. Very rare pieces. Robert Butler was known really exclusively for his wildlife paintings. Charles Walker, also well known for his wildlife depictions. So it is this very uneasy sort of group because, they are not all stylistically uniform. Some, were really focused on one particular subset of what we consider to be Highwaymen, and we're not really doing other things. So the variety, I think, is quite interesting and intriguing to people in particular. If you think the Highwaymen, this show, I think, will perhaps broaden your understanding. So then we've gone back we've crossed the first gallery and gone into this gallery where you can almost, our director likes to say that she can almost feel the heat radiating off of these paintings. This incredible selection of fire skies, these brilliant orange, beautiful landscapes that have all been kind of united in this one gallery. So you are just overwhelmed by the intensity of the color palette, particularly. But these are again, you might think they took major liberties. They're certainly, there's a kind of slight exaggeration of maybe of the saturation, but these colors exist in the Florida landscape. Al Black is represented by one painting in the show. He was a very important figure in the Highwaymen movement, who unfortunately passed away earlier this year. But he was the great salesman of the Highwaymen. Marianne Carroll, the only highwaywoman, said that he could sell a jacket to a mosquito in the summer, which I love that. I don't totally understand what it means, but I think it means that he could, basically sell anything to anyone. He started kind of working with those artists in Alfred Hare's orbit and would take their works, maybe take 30 paintings, stick them in the back of his car, drive off and sell them door to door out of doctors' offices and come back with a stack of cash. He was skimming a lot of that cash from the artists. They were not always getting paid. He was also painting, often signing his name on paintings that were not done by him, which he was a brilliant salesman and knew that he could command more money if he said, well, not only will you get a painting, but I'll sign it for you right on the spot. He was very savvy. He also really knew how to negotiate the sort of racial divisions. He knew exactly how to sort of play up certain themes that he knew would appeal to a white audience. So he wanted, he was able to sort of, I think, make people feel as though they were being very benevolent by supporting him. And he was really laughing all the way to the bank, and was an incredible salesman. He was also involved in less legal enterprises and went to jail for a number of years and painted large-scale murals in various prisons around Florida. He took up painting primarily after Alfred Hare died, and made his own career as an artist as well. So here are some overview shots of this amazing sunset gallery. Lots of different artists represented. This is all in conversation with each other. I think I wanted also the paintings to sort of, it's dense, but not as dense as most presentations of Highwaymen work. When you see Highwaymen work in museums in Florida, it's often hung in a dense salon hang, which I wanted to avoid because I really wanted the individual works to be considered individually, with the exception of the Poinciana tree grouping, which I couldn't help myself. There are also sort of more oddities, these sort of surprising, very rare works in the show. This wall, as we're looking into the final gallery, we see on the left this really remarkable painting of a Seminole campfire from the 1960s by Harold Newton from Scott Schlesinger's collection. It's really interesting, and I hope someone will do a greater work on this to look at these African American depictions of indigenous Americans who themselves were also in many cases the product of intermarriage between escaped slaves fleeing to Florida and indigenous peoples. So there's a lot of complexity to unravel here. But the Seminole people, another kind of bit of history that's really underrepresented in the North, the history of the Seminoles and their resistance to the U.S. government's forced removal from their lands, and as many of their people were sent to the plains, to Oklahoma, to reservations, Seminoles retreated to the Everglades and then emerged in the 20th century in response to an increased tourist market, and were able to, like the Highwaymen, sort of take advantage of these situations that were quite oppressive overall, but carve out paths and ways of survival. So they created their own tourist destinations. They created alligator wrestling as a way to appeal to tourists who were looking for these quote unquote authentic experiences. Of course, alligator wrestling was not part of Seminole culture traditionally, but they were able to resist through their ability to adapt and be resilient. So we're in the final gallery here, which we have a variety of works largely grouped around this kind of shared color palette, this blue color palette. We have great shore scenes. Marianne Carroll here, Rodney Demps, who's considered to be the surrealist of the group. There's one work by him in the exhibition, this beautiful Harold Newton, Waves on the Jetty. And then these sort of river scenes, Marianne Carroll represented with this beautiful painting of St. Lucie River with water hyacinth. This James Gibson, who is one of my favorites of the Highwaymen, he has such a distinctive style that immediately makes you think of kind of the 70s and this color palette, and has this, almost black painting on velvet feel. Livingston Roberts as well. Here's a view from this final gallery looking at the great assortment of sunset pictures. Also very rare to find depictions of Black life in Fort Pierce. There's a River Road painting by Roy McClendon on the left, and then a very rare Orange Grove painting by Livingston Roberts. Of course, painting was a way to escape the backbreaking labor of the orange groves, but the orange grove was a marketable, saleable motif for the Highwaymen artists. Zora Neale Hurston factors into the story. I won't read this quote, but feel free to. It's included quite large in vinyl above the St. Lucie River with hyacinth painting by Marianne Carroll, because Zora Neale Hurston, who spent a lot of her childhood in Florida, ended up back in Florida at the end of her life and lived in Fort Pierce. James Gibson, who actually I just pointed out was a student of hers and actually one of the pallbearers at her funeral. She was connected with Beanie Bacchus in many ways. She worked as a school teacher. She unfortunately also was economically distressed and had to work, lived in abject poverty and worked as a maid for a time before her life was cut short fairly young. So Zora Neale Hurston is represented in this exhibition, just again trying to bring out more nuance to this story. When I visited Florida, I had the opportunity to visit Zora Neale Hurston's grave. She was buried in Fort Pierce. This is her home on the left. Alice Walker, the writer of The Color Purple, actually rediscovered Zora Neale Hurston's burial site. She was buried in an unmarked grave, and Alice Walker raised funds to erect a permanent monument. And I'll mention sort of the end of the first wave of Highwaymen came, I think, if you want to, like the sort of final date, if you want to say, really coincided with the death of Alfred Hare, who died, tragically young, was murdered at a bar in Fort Pierce, and this was a really difficult moment for a lot of the Highwaymen artists, and this sort of coincided with a decline overall in the marketability of their paintings, and their legacy, though, continues to live on. I visited a number of the sites, burial sites of Highwaymen painters. It's a really fascinating period of art history that I hope that this show will continue to inspire people to delve into and discover. I'll just very briefly, I know we're over time now, and thank you for sticking with me if you have. The Captive Lands show, which is the complimentary exhibition, deals broadly with the idea of what does it mean to capture the landscape. So much of what is talked about is how the Highwaymen captured the spirit of this particular moment in time. But what does it mean to capture? What does that word capture mean when applied to the landscape? So there's no sort of right answer by any means. And I presented 5 different sections, each dealing with the theme of capture in a different way. The first section, this is a photograph of a very dense salon wall in this very first section, deals with capturing the ideal or idealized landscape. So here we have a grand assortment of Hudson River School paintings from the Addison's permanent collection, works by artists like Martin Johnson Heed, George Innes, Samuel Coleman, Doty, Samuel Cole, Frederick Church. I think I also wanted to sort of, the way that people are so easily kind of look at the Highwaymen and think of them as this monolith and think of this sort of shared kind of uniformity of style. I don't think we often think about that in relation to the Hudson River School. But when you start to engage with these paintings, you'll see that these artists are really making very similar works. There are certain things, like there's almost always a figure in red in the foreground. There's almost always this visual pathway into the scene. So starting to kind of apply the tool or the ways of looking at Highwaymen to kind of turn that around and look critically at our own kind of landscape tradition, or the more kind of common landscape tradition, and also to call out in a way how selective museums are in terms of geography. So all of these scenes, with the exception of maybe 1 or 2, are really from New York, New England, the Northeast generally. And that's the bulk of American, particularly in this area of the world, American landscape collections. When you go into a 19th century gallery, for example, at the Met, you really only see the Northeast. But there's a lot more of America, and there were other traditions that are often overlooked. The also in this gallery, I've put a Roy McClendon painting in dialogue with this great painting by an unknown artist, likely of a family in New England, where you have the natural world, this kind of picture perfect, uh, almost framed, or is it a window, landscape through this very staged portrait of a family. And then looking at Roy McClendon, who's on the right, where he's this really interesting work that combines so many different modes of painting. You have still life, and then you have this landscape within a painting that's quite interesting. The third gallery deals with tourism. I mentioned earlier, looking at Florida and Niagara Falls and tracing their sort of parallel paths. I have an entire wall of Walker Evans work, including a Walker Evans painting, which was very likely inspired by his own travels in Florida. He was fascinated by vernacular architecture, and also inspired by Jacob Lawrence, an African-American artist, in his style of painting. He's, of course, better known for his photographs, and he, in 1941, completed a commission for a book that on the Mangrove Coast by Carl Bickle, which was sort of a travel guide and sort of memoir about the west coast of Florida. So again, thinking about how Florida is a theme that runs throughout this second complementary show, and is foregrounded really throughout. So I think, what does it mean to tell a history of American landscape with Florida foregrounded is something that I wanted to get at in this show. Tourist material is also discussed. We have, Niagara Falls on one side, on the left-hand side, and then this case of Florida material and related works, largely drawn from our collection, hanging above. Then the final two galleries on the left is a part of a gallery that deals with the idea of how do you capture history, memory, trauma in the landscape. So looking at works that engage with histories of enslavement in the United States, the Civil War. There's an entire section on Fort Marion, which is a fort in St. Augustine, Florida, that in the 1870s was essentially an open-air prison that housed a number of imprisoned indigenous Americans from the plains, who were encouraged by the superintendent of this prison to draw. So we have ledger drawings that were produced at Fort Marion. So again, looking at Florida as this major current throughout, because I think in the Northeast, and I know a lot of Floridians are on the call, I think that people in the Northeast think of Florida man. There's a great quote by Carl Hyacin and he says, I think in the old days, the nexus of weirdness ran through Southern California and to a degree, New York City. I think it's changed so that every bizarre story in the country now has a Florida connection. I don't know why, except it must be some inversion of magnetic poles or something. I think that's unfortunately the way that I certainly felt about Florida before working on this project. It's a part of our history that people in the Northeast do not want to engage with, but must engage with, and I think it provides a lot of insight into the state of our country and our culture broadly. On the right hand side is this kind of last component, and that's a section that deals with the West. Unfortunately, Florida doesn't factor into the West. But we have a lot of the West is really well represented in our collection. So again, examining the own kind of geographical blind spots of the Addison's collection, which is a collection of American art that has no regional focus, but focuses quite explicitly on the Northeast and the West. And so again, looking at us as an institution and looking at ideas of geographic diversity, what is missing from this larger story of American art. And Florida really has and continues to be an amazing